Thomas, Associate Director for Programs here at the Center for the Study of Southern Culture. Thank you all for joining us today for today's SouthTalk. I'm super excited for it. Nothing is done alone. The SouthTalk series isn't possible without some key individuals. I will even add one to my list, Andrew Bryant, who is our operations manager, who just helped me with a battery. So thank you, Andrew. I also wanted to thank Rebecca Locke-Cleary, our communication specialist that spreads the word about all of our SouthTalks, Greta Kashanina, who is going to film our talk, films all of them, and uploads them to our YouTube channel, and CeeLo Ricketts for making the fabulous graphics. Now, let me introduce today's speaker. So our theme for the academic year is Southern environments, and we have heard about built environments, we have learned about PCB, soil spill, or intentional one in rural North Carolina. And today we're going to talk about the vibe, the feeling of a space through music, and just general vibe and feeling. So I'm excited about that. This book is on sale in our lobby. It is great. I told Dr. Miles that I had a hard time putting it down, but I needed to get some work done. So I cannot wait to return to it. So let me introduce the writer, sociologist, and ethnographer, Dr. Corey J. Miles, is an ethnographer of the Black South and an assistant professor of sociology and Africana studies at Tulane University. His book, Vibe, The Sounds and Feeling of Black Life in the American South, investigates how Black people have built the South while simultaneously excluded from it. Miles captures the complexity of Black life and death in the American South in his work. His work has been published in the Journal of Hip Hop Studies, Cultural Studies, the Howard Journal of Communication, Humanity and Society, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. And I told him I had an anecdote that I would say from the microphone. And that is that, we plan these talks and they're around a theme, but then I think a little serendipity got in there. Today when I came in, I always put the PowerPoints and check them in the mornings. And when I came in, some professor, and I know who the professor is, left something that they were teaching in class. And what they were teaching was a song by Lil Wayne featuring Robin Thicke. It's Tie My Hands. And on one side are the song lyrics, and on the other side is the impact or what those lyrics are saying. It's kind of unpacking what those lyrics mean. And that particular song is about Hurricane Katrina, and Lil Wayne is from Holly Grove, New Orleans, Louisiana. And so I just thought it all comes together today: music, vibe, environment, Black people. So with that, help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Miles.
Thank you for that kind intro. Thank y'all for the invite. I was just telling my new friend that I just got here from New Orleans. I drove up and literally got to the hotel maybe 10 minutes before you got there. So I'm trained as a sociologist, and only maybe 10 minutes before I got here, I realized no sociologist was gonna be here. So now I'm trying to reshape kind of how I wanna do this, in part because often kind of how I do sociology or science in general. Some sociologists say it's not real sociology. And so sometimes I feel like I have to kind of prove to them as opposed to just telling the story that I want to tell. So I think I'm gonna do a little bit more of just kind of telling the story I want to tell as opposed to kind of following the script. And so my book is about Southern trap music in North Carolina. Are we familiar with trap music? Trap music, yeah. So like we think about like Future, we think about, say, I don't know, Rilo Rodriguez, T.I., Yo Gotti. And part of what right, I wanted to do with this book was, if we take Southern Black folks who live in a quote-unquote hood, if we take them seriously as thinkers, as feelers, as people with imaginations, can they tell us something about what and where the South is? And so for my book, I spent 4 years living with and in community with these artists. And so, and what you realize is when you live with music artists, that so much of their life, right, isn't actually making music, but it's spending time with their family, it's conversations with their grannies. And so part of what the research I do is, it's their music, but it's also the life that, right, surrounds the music. And this one Friday afternoon, me and this artist named Boom, we're driving to a hip hop showcase. And essentially what a hip hop showcase is the radio station, right, puts on this contest, and whoever wins gets a song on the radio, they get free studio time, and me and Boom are in the car together. And we're in this rural city, and we're driving down this long road, and this police officer's behind us. And so I noticed the police officer, and I noticed Boom, and he sits up a little straighter in his seat. His fingers grips the steering wheel a little tighter. He turns the music down, almost as if, right, the cop could hear into the car. And upon the cop, right, going straight through the stoplight and us making a right, Boom's body becomes a little bit more relaxed. And for me, I think about that as what I might call an interaction with the criminal justice system, even though that moment won't come up in any type of criminal justice archive. When you're doing research for a few years in a place when everyone else kind of works, and I'm just kind of walking around interviewing people, folks ask you for favors. So sometimes I babysat folks' kids. And this young girl, at the time she was 16, her name is Kayla, and she just goes to Walmart with me. And I walk around, I don't really see anything that I want. As I'm walking out of Walmart without purchasing anything, she kind of stops behind me. And she says, hey, if you walk out and don't buy anything, they're gonna think we're stealing. And I just kind of like motion her to come on. And what I notice is that she's responding to a type of assumption about her where she almost has to perform innocence. And so for me, I'm thinking about how when you live in a place for 4 years doing research, that these mundane moments make up the bulk of my time there. That the few murders that have happened, the occasional police arrests, the maybe 1 or 2 high-profile police incidents were only small pieces of this larger experience that I had. And so I'm thinking about how academics oftentimes, and the media sensationalizes, right, the point where a bullet, right, hits a person and the police officer is the person behind the gun. But what I'm seeing through these little small moments is that our policing system is slowly undoing people, right, years, months before a bullet is even brought into the equation. And so I'm thinking about, as a researcher, right, how do these moments, right, tell us something about our criminal justice system? How do they tell us something that quantification doesn't get to? Because oftentimes what we do is we look at, right, data points and statistics, and we use those data points as indicators of how our systems function. But what I'm trying to look at is these in-between spaces, these moments that matter profoundly, but never show up in an archive. They don't register as moments. And so in my book, and you read this part because you're a couple of pages in it, so I know you read this part. So the opening vignette, so the opening story of my book is a story about a rapper named Primo. And I was listening to a song, and in the song he says, I got bad blood on my hands, right? For us to eat, I had to cause the bleeding. And essentially, it's a song about committing crimes so his family, right, can have some source of material support. And for me, like in the book, I say, well, I really didn't want to talk to Primo about his music. But when I heard that song, I felt something. And so I want to have a conversation about feelings, about what type of relationships with your neighborhood, with your grandma, with your mother would lead a person to make these types of songs, right? And so part of what I'm trying to do in the book is to say songs that are about violence, right, aren't necessarily about violence. Because we can watch, right, horror films. So if y'all know them horror films, say Carrie, and if you know the horror film Get Out, both of them use violence as these type of tools. But we can argue Carrie's about patriarchy and the violence that young girls face in school. And we can talk about Get Out maybe as about type of racialized violence. And so what I'm thinking about then is even though trap rappers, the songs use violence, but it's a rhetorical tool, but layered within it is a different type of meaning. And so that night with Primo, after we spend maybe a few hours talking about life, absent fathers, women that we would never have a chance with, when we leave, Primo tells me, hey, man, you got a good vibe. And at that moment, right, I thought Primo was saying something about my personality. But what I grow to realize is when he says I have a good vibe, he's talking about a type of relationality. He's talking about a type of experience with me, right? And so for me, vibe then becomes this way to kind of understand how social experiences and places are forged. And the thing that me and Primo talked about the most was the criminal justice system. And he has a criminal record, I don't. But the way we think about the criminal justice system, right, would say that me and him are just disparately positioned towards it. So I'm trying to use vibe as a way to understand how Primo, how Boone, how Kayla, all of us forge connections through feeling police, even though we just have different relationships with these quantifiable experiences. And so for me, I'm thinking about how I'm not trying to appropriate people's experiences with the criminal justice system, but it's that even though I might have slid through the cracks of that system and not been, right, chained and boxed in a cage, that sliding didn't produce some type of scars, and that me and Primo and Boone might not connect over this specific type of pain. And so what I'm thinking about then is if a person looks at me, I teach at a university, I get invited to this university to talk about a book I wrote, right, that I might seem conventionally successful, right, on the surface. And what some people may frame it as that I avoided being a quote unquote statistic. And so the question I'm thinking about is, does avoiding being a statistic mean you avoid anti-Blackness or patriarchy altogether? So what I'm thinking about then is even if we can increase diversity rates on campus, even if we can have, right, a Black Indian woman president, does that necessarily mean that systems aren't just as violent as they were before? But oftentimes when we see folks of color and women successful, we want to credit the system and not the endurance of those people. And so what I'm thinking about then is looking away from these, right, quantitative data points as being indicators that things are better, but thinking about the vibe of a place. Because oftentimes what my women, queer students, students of color tell me is, yeah, they represent some form of diversity on my campus, but it's hard as hell to be there. They still face some type of emotional trauma that's difficult to quantify. And so what I'm thinking about then is like, how do we get to that? Does that tell us something about the social world? And so then what I'm thinking about, or I guess we call it research questions. So I don't really say questions because I think questions necessitates an answer. And I don't think my book really answers anything, but it's some things I'm concerned about. And I felt if I could write a book that spoke to certain people, we might be able to gather like this and kind of talk through those things. So the things I'm concerned about is, how do people know where a place is? Right? So if I ask somebody like, where's Oxford? I think there's different ways we can address that question. But particularly what I'm thinking about is from the point of North Carolina. So I'm in what we call the 252 area code of North Carolina, which is essentially the northernmost part of North Carolina. So once you get past the last county, you're in Virginia. And so I'll call North Carolina like up south. And so some folks might say, well, North Carolina or maybe Virginia, Maryland, maybe aren't the South. And so part of my thinking is, how do we make those negotiations? What would lead one to say that, I don't know, Baltimore maybe is the South, if we think about Frederick Douglass, if we think about slavery. And so part of me then thinking about where is the South, or how do people know where they are, is really looking at types of relationships. And so people in North Carolina, they feel Southern in part because of that region's history with racism, because of that history's relationship with slavery. They talk about accents, they talk about foodways, and these become the things, right, that people will say, well, North Carolina is the South. It's not looking at, say, colonial lines on a map. And so in part, when I'm thinking about where is a place, I'm thinking about what sets of relationships make a place, right? What differentiates this room from what's over there, right? On the outside, this can just be seen as one building. But when we get to the particulars of it, we see these rooms have different flavors, different people that allow us to distinguish between them. And the second piece, when I'm thinking about, right, how do people know where they're at, I'm thinking about temporality, which is kind of like a fancy word for, say, time. And so when I'm thinking about what makes North Carolina Southern, I'm thinking about how is North Carolina positioned in time? How close or far is it from what we would call the Old South or antebellum South? Where in the United States, progress myths will have us believe that the South today is somewhere different than it was in the 1850s or the 1940s when my granny was living, or 1967 when my mother was born. And so for me, I'm thinking about, how does the South serve as this type of temporal or this measure of time? And for America to be seen as a democracy today, we need a type of distance between the Old South. And so for me then to answer these questions, I'm using then vibe. How can a vibe of a place tell us something about it, right? Independently of racial diversity statistics, independently of, right, kind of colonial markers. And what I mean by that, just kind of traditional hegemonic ways in which we name marketplace. But how does the way in which a place feel tell us something about where it is and how people relate to it? And so it ain't no sociologist here, but if there were, right, I might stick on this point a little further. So in part, right, the thing that I'm trying to push back in my discipline is that we look at incarceration rates, we look at, say, infant mortality rates, and then we look at that data, and then we use that disparity to claim we know something about Black people. So a professor can research, right, Black folks and be an expert on Black people without even knowing a Black person. And what I'm trying to do is say it's a gap between what that type of quantifiable data says and who Black people actually are. That Black people shouldn't always show up in our research as sites of disparity. That if a person takes a class on Blackness, it shouldn't be this already assumption that this is going to be a class about oppression. That's part of the experience, but it's more to it. And so I'm trying to get my discipline and think about Black people as lively, Black people as beautiful, as artistic, as silly, as, right, these just human. I think that might be just the word that'll get to it for me. So we don't need that. So yeah, so these are some folks, right, that I appreciate their work. I'll just shout out Brian Foster's book, I Don't Like the Blues, because B work here. But essentially people who influence my work are people who think about the texture of life. Like, how can that something elseness of life tell us something about how we build systems, how the world functions? Okay. And just a quick talk about methodology. So For my research, I spent 2 years just living in Northeast North Carolina, then another 2 years making kind of like visits whenever I could. So that might be for a month, for a summer, for holidays. And essentially what I do then is I interview people, I look at archival data, I listen to music, I go to shows. I essentially try to do life with the people I'm working with. And so Imani Perry says that her research, she doesn't want to give voice to the voiceless. And I want to do something similar to where I feel like that if my goal as a researcher, as a professor, as a scholar, if I let go of this idea to be an expert on Black people and just say, what if I just vibe with Black people? What type of new considerations might be made visible? Rather than transforming, and which I do this, right? So this idea that what happens to the body when it's transformed into a data point, which I do transform people into data, but what happens when we interrogate that, right? And so part of what I'm trying to think about is a different way to do science. That science oftentimes is centered on objectivity, rationality, which is important. But what my work is trying to do is to say that slipperiness, messiness, vibes aren't antithetical to objectivity and rationality. That they give us different entry points into different ideas. But a more, I guess, Western idea would have those be in tension. But my work is saying there's a bunch of folks doing quote unquote or attempting to do objective research. But what I want to do is to think about how do we fail at actually representing communities? And can those failures tell us something? And so that's where this idea of vibe comes from. So I'm trying to get people, or I'm thinking about moments that people really can't articulate, but it's something about the vibe, and I'm trying to get to that. And so in my book, and since I'm not going to go through all the chapters, so the first chapter, which I'm kind of focusing on right now, is just kind of locate the South. Like, where is the South? Some people might say Miami ain't the South, but Tallahassee is the South. And like, why would people make those types of claims? Second chapter, I'm looking at, this is more the music theory. We're making a case why songs about guns and drugs and violence are so important. And for me, what that type of music does is gives us an entry point into grief, into pain, into anger. When folks of color or any marginalized group of people are always asked to suffer gracefully, to suffer quietly, to suffer the right way. And for me, trap music allows us to talk about that suffering in ways that push back against respectability. The third chapter, I'm looking at this relationship between queerness and Black people in the hood. Because oftentimes we might say that poor white folks are the epitome of racism. Black people in the hood are homophobic and queerphobic. And so what I'm trying to do is, what happens when we bring queer theory into the hood? What becomes legible? And the fourth chapter is about placemaking. How do you make home in a place that's violent and dangerous? How does the place that we often, or why does the place that we often call home is the place where some of our worst memories are? And what does it look like to live with those, right? So making a case that violence, pain, anger doesn't disqualify a place from being home, but it actually just complicates what a home is. And so I'm gonna go through this concept that I use, right? And it's called felt criminality. And so I'm not gonna talk about, I wanna talk about the music piece, but I'm really gonna talk about this concept that I have, like felt criminality. And for me, if we take that concept seriously, what do we know differently about the South? And so one afternoon, sitting on the hood of a car with Sabrina, and she just moved into an economically and racially diverse neighborhood where she lived in the housing projects in a town called Weldon, North Carolina before. And the school system there, the schools had ceiling tiles falling, so students assigned seats was literally based around where the ceiling wasn't leaking from. Students had to go to the restroom with an adult just because, right, the restrooms were unsanitary and essentially almost dangerous. Students would be suspended or expelled from school if they took any material home from school. So the school only had enough material for in class. And so taking something home, right, you would be punished for it. And so for me, because of the lack of resources, they had to police those children at an all-black school. And so Sabrina says, right, you know what, I'm gonna just move. And then what we get to with Sabrina, and so when I'm talking to her, she starts to tell me this story about how her son just plays in the neighborhood with all the other kids. They jump on one neighbor's trampoline, they get in another neighbor's swimming pool, and one Saturday, her nephew comes, and these two black boys, right, do the same routine. And as they're in another neighbor's yard, right, on the pool, on the trampoline, the neighbor calls the police on the kids. And Sabrina suspects it's because none of the white kids were out there, right? For her, right, the white kids gave her son a type of validity, but since it was only his black cousin, right, they called the police. And as Sabrina's telling me this story, she says, they treated my son like a criminal, and I don't want him to feel like that, right? And so for her, what struck me was it wasn't that her son had police contact, it wasn't that he could have been harmed, but when she said, I don't want him to feel like that, she was saying even if they did think he was a criminal, or even if he was treated like one, it was something about her trying to salvage his emotions that was important for her to communicate it in that way. And so for me, that moment becomes important because in an all-black school, it was a type of policing that was due to circumstances of inadequate resources. When she moved to the diverse school, he was policed because of his blackness. And so this idea of mobility didn't get him out of a system of policing. And so thinking with Sabrina, I'm thinking about this idea of like felt criminality, where on one hand, people of color feel criminal. This is why earlier Kayla told me I had to buy something. This is why when black folks, right, go to a CVS and they ask, do you want a receipt? They always get one because, right, you have to prove. And you have to prove it because of what I'm calling felt criminality. And on the flip side, I get a story from Bill. So Bill is he's 27 at the time, single father, music artist. He still makes music to this day. He uploaded a song yesterday. And so Bill tells like really long, drawn out stories. So I think I only maybe in this interview that I'm about to cite, maybe asked like 3 questions. And the interview was like an hour and 30 minutes because like he would tell a really long story in it whenever I asked one thing. And so he was telling me about his grandmother's house being broken into. And then so essentially I'm asking about like safety concerns in his neighborhood. And this is just kind of a little snippet of what he says. Well, black folks around here ain't got no unity. But the number one thing is probably gonna be the police. They put so much fear in everyone. Say if I'm a killer, no one around here gonna be scared of me. But if folks see the police, they scared. This man a whole killer, but you scared of police. Probably because the police can do what they feel, but a killer can't just go do whatever, right? And Bill is saying this like in a joking way, but to me it's striking because, right, one, he's complicating who makes a neighborhood unsafe, right? And what Bill is saying is a person who's known to have committed crimes can't just go around and do things or harm people just even if they had a desire to. But he's saying police officers can, in part because, right, police officers' emotions and feelings are validated. So a police officer can harm someone if the police officer feels intimidated or threatened. That there are systems and structures that lets the police officer know that he has a right to his emotions in the way what Bill is saying that folks in the neighborhood just don't. That actually doing a police encounter, part of your job, and this is what Bill tells me later, is to make sure the police officer feels safe. And so felt criminality then, on the other hand, it's this idea that if you don't perform emotions in ways that uplift the current system, you will be treated like a criminal. This is why we see mothers who, right, yell in the courtrooms when their children are being killed by police officers, held in contempt of court. As if screaming in a courtroom because your child was murdered, right, isn't an acceptable type of performance. It's this idea that you have to perform your emotions in ways that legitimate whoever has power. And so for me, this idea of felt criminality, one is thinking about how folks of color actually feel like criminals and they have to perform a type of innocence. And on the other hand, if you don't perform emotions, if you don't smile, you might be seen as the angry black girl, right? If you don't, right, walk to the other side of the street, the person right behind you might think you're suspicious or sketchy. This way that these small, mundane moments of navigating how folks feel. And so for me, I'm taking this then. And I'm gonna kind of circle it around and wrap it up. And I hope in the Q&A we can talk about the music a little bit. And to think about if we take this to be true, right? If this is how Black people experience the South, what does that say about what and where the South is? And so, Zandria Robinson, right, and Marcus Hunter, they kind of remap the US. And so for me, I think about folks like Malcolm X. So Malcolm X says, well, as long as you south of the Canadian border, then you in the South, right? And I don't think Malcolm X was denying regional differences, but rather he was problematizing how we understand, right, these colonial borders. And so if the South, at least in how the US makes it seem, is where the racial problem exists, then Malcolm X is saying everywhere in the United States is the South because the racial problem is everywhere. And James Baldwin does this. So James Baldwin says the problem with Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida is America's problem. And for me, I'm bringing North Carolina into this. More recently, Kiese Layman, who spent time here, wrote about when he was pulled over by a police officer in New York. And when he steps out the car, he looks at his long patch of grass. And in the book, he says, I think Mississippi is on the other side of that field. And what he's doing is collapsing this ideological distance between a supposedly progressive New York and a supposedly racist Mississippi. And so for me, I'm thinking about how the South functions as a type of ideological extraction. The South is where racism is. And so for me, I'm thinking about then, how does race manifest in important ways for the people I work with? And it's the carceral system. So then I'm taking kind of what they do and say, well, what becomes that thing that connects these places, right? So I'm not saying that they aren't different, but for me, the thing that connects them is this carceral experience, is this experience of feeling policed, surveilled, where to rename then the US as the carceral South is really then to think about how the world-making and the world-breaking ideologies of the antebellum South had a type of temporal and spatial continuity that when we abolished slavery, we never abolished the ideas that made slavery possible in the first place. And those ideas was about capital accumulation that's predicated on the underdevelopment of another person. We never let that go. We simply changed the contours for how we do that. And so then naming then Northeast North Carolina, the carceral South, is really just a shorthand to think about how movement across region, across time, doesn't negate the criminalization of Blackness, that folks' skin doesn't get lighter with movement, where George Floyd left Houston because of a disaster and met Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis. And so I'm thinking then about the South as being a type of modern ideological construction, in some ways to give systems a pass. That racism is this Southern thing that's attached to angry people. And then I'm kind of appropriating and using a type of satire to say, well, if that is, right, a part of the texture of the South, then that's just a part of the texture of America. And so I'm doing this through using feeling as a way in which to kind of understand space. And the last example, which is actually a music example. So this artist, his name is Drop. He's like short, well, to me he's short, like I'm 6 foot. So he's like 5'7", which to me, I guess isn't short. But he has a really big personality. And so like his personality takes up space in ways, right, that height doesn't. And so it's our first meeting, and we're just kind of kicking it in this bar, and just to kind of feel out like the awkward tension of kind of like first meeting somebody, I just ask him about his music. And so what he does is he pulls out his phone. It was difficult for him to put a word to describe his music. And so he pulls out his cell phone, he places it on the table, and he starts rapping along with it. And the song essentially goes, right, I got heart, little nigga. I was ready from the start, little nigga. And then I start to essentially do the ad-libs on the song. So little nigga like ended every line. And so I start doing that with them. And then eventually we just kind of laugh at maybe my cracked voice or way it was difficult for me to get the right pitch and tone. But for me, I'm thinking about how if he would have asked me to rate his music from 1 to 10, that quantifiable number wouldn't have did as much work as him hearing my voice be a part of his song. That we produced a moment, an aura, a social atmosphere. We shaped the vibe of that moment together through our relationality in ways that just naming that moment wouldn't have got to. It's where, I don't know, riding a bus sitting beside a stranger feels differently than riding a bus sitting beside somebody you're attracted to. Which is why, I don't know, for my students at least, y'all might probably get better professors here, but for my students at least, an hour in my class feels a hell of a lot longer than an hour at a party, right? In part because the vibe is different, the relationality is different. So we experience time and space just differently through, right, this relationality. And so for me, I'm thinking then about how what me and Drop did was a type of refusal of geography, to where through how we related to each other, that moment, that bar felt like it was there for us. And so the book then is trying to think about when we have conversations, we never say, what do you feel? We ask people, how do you feel? And how is a process? How is a way of being? And so even in our language, it's already baked in that there's a how to feeling. And I think how we feel, right, tells us something about the systems in which we feel within. And I'm trying to get to those through music, through folks who rap about pain and grief, and see if that can tell us one small, minuscule story about what and where the South is. Thank y'all. All right. Yeah. Oh,
I was just wondering what enticed you to go to Northeast North Carolina, because you were talking about how it's sort of like when you're defining what the South may be, that's not generally lumped into it. So I'm just wondering why you chose to go there.
No. Thank you for that question. And so my family's from there, and also because I think there's a lot of ambiguity around North Carolina, particularly around music, particularly around policing. And so the first iterations of policing, right, is argued to happen in this region, right? So through slave patrols if I ask somebody about what does North Carolina music sound like, it's difficult to kind of pinpoint what that sound is in a way that we know Atlanta or New York sound. When I talk about, so people from New York, because I-95 travels through there, so people from New York would say people from this region, like it's like really, really Southern, right? It's the epitome of Southernness because of just the kind of relationality and the migration that happens between the two regions in a way that I think in the beginning of the book, the people from Alabama, like that ain't really South. And so I think it was just a lot of complexities around it and a lot of unanswered questions. And yeah, and I think it just kind of set up a moment to where I don't have answers about, I would say North Carolina is the South, right? And I also think when people may say, well, it's not the Deep South, this idea that the Deep South is more Southern than a different type of South. And I think it just kind of set up interesting conversations around that. So yeah, so those are like some of the reasons. Thank you. Yes.
Given the way that you approach your research, like your sociology in your own way, do you think it's more important to answer your research questions or for you to open up like people's like ideas of how you approach this? Like which do you think is more important?
Yeah, I think that's one of them questions where you already know what I'm gonna say. Like I think you know the answer that I'm gonna give, and you just want me to explain. But so yeah, no, I appreciate that question, right? So I think for me, I study Southern Black people. I can go on the internet and find 1 million articles about different ways Southern Black people suffer. So I don't think I need to ask a new question about how do Black people suffer and then answer that question, then create policies when we already know that. I don't need to kind of recreate this cycle. And so for me, as opposed to trying to ask a different question and then answer it and become the quote unquote expert, I want to do just, for me, and just kind of like how I do my career. But I think that other work is important, but for me, I want to frustrate knowledge. Can we think and feel differently? Can we understand science differently? Can we ask better questions? And for me, the best questions are the ones, right, with multiple or no answers, that they get us to imagine differently. Because I think the last point I think I made to the question is I was probably a lot more radical human being as an undergrad, that I thought change, imagined worlds not a little more flamboyant than kind of how I think about the world now. And so part of what happens when you get a PhD is you get disciplined to think about the world from a particular framework. And I think part of then my work is to undiscipline that. And so in my book, right, my writing style, which some people say that's not sociological, is I wanted to borrow my grandmama's voice. Like, can I tell a story from how my grandma sounded? Can I kind of push back against this notion that we have to sound like an expert and sound smart and actually say something that people, right, resonate with? So yeah, so I think for me, I like the second part, but I do see the importance to, but it's just so many other people do the first part that I think I can complement it in my own kind of weirdly shaped way. Yes.
What you did was kind of a mixture of observation style of sociological research and kind of an immersion.
Yeah.
How did you satisfy kind of objectivity when you were being reviewed?
Yeah. So, let me see. So, me and this person, we got debating on Twitter one time. So he was like, you want to study inequality with vibes, which is what I do, be a sociologist. And if you want to study it with precision and objectivity, be an economist, right? And I think, and I actually agree with him. If sociologists studied with vibes, my work would be a lot more popular. I might get paid a little bit more. And so I wasn't mad at him. But what I was thinking about with him is, what's the logics that would let him make that statement? Right, so the logic was that objectivity, precision gets to a type of truth that, say, vibe just doesn't. Right? And so for me, I don't wholesale agree with that, to where I think we can have different types of entry points into truth, right? So where, for me, objectivity, even if it was obtainable, I'm not sure it's always useful, right? Where for me, oftentimes what I see objectivity do is mask people's biases in this idea of objectivity, that when it's really difficult not to be objective. So I'm gonna pick the question I ask, I'm gonna pick the places I go. Like, even I speak English, even the language I use, I'm already implicated into a knowledge system. And so for me to say I'm objective and not name that knowledge system I'm implicated in and how that structures knowledge, to me isn't objective. I think that's just kind of denying how subjectivity is just part of human life, right? Where this idea that, so me and my students, like first day of class, we talk about, did humans invent science or did we find science? And oftentimes my students will say, well, there may be natural properties in the world and we invented a mechanism, right, to gauge and gesture towards those properties. And then so if science in and of itself is a type of subjective construction, I don't necessarily need then to claim myself as just an objective researcher if science in itself isn't wholly objective. I think we only need to name the objective if I want to be seen as the purveyor of truth, if I want to marginalize other voices, if I want to say I have something that's tangibly real. I think objectivity allows you to make those claims, but more pointed to the question that I think you're asking me is, right, how can I tell an honest story when I'm so immersed in it? And I think that's the kind of question you're asking. And I think when it's people that you're close to and you develop a relationship with them, it forces you to be more precise, in part because you're more accountable. Because if I do say something that's wrong, anybody can just send me a text message and say it's just kind of, well, this isn't what happened, this isn't right. And so for me, I think the immersion part puts some more of a scientific demand on me, because it's not just the university I have to be accountable to, but actually people that I know, that I care about. Yeah. I went on a tangent before I got to your question, and hopefully that was cool.
There's a theory of juvenile delinquency called labeling theory.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I know labeling theory.
Is that similar to felt criminality?
So just a,
Repeat the question, just for people.
okay, yeah. And so the question is asking me this idea of like labeling theory. And for those who don't know, so labeling theory is this, in part, it's used differently, right? So sociologists will use labeling theory as behaviors in and of themselves hold no social value. It's until we label it as such that it becomes that in the social world, right? So you can smoke weed in one part of the world and it's not labeled a crime, but you can smoke weed in another part, right? And it is. Or we can think about how differently shaped bodies can do same behaviors and we just read those behaviors differently, right? Because of the labeling becomes how behaviors kind of take on meaning. And so this question is asking me about that in the context of, right, felt criminality. And which is an interesting question that I haven't thought about, but if I can give like kind of an off-the-cuff response, I think one clear relationship I see was it expands kind of our labeling repertoire to where Kiese Layman, right, who is here, he says, right, my unacknowledged scars often, right, hurt more than the ones people see. So things we can see and clearly label as violent, we oftentimes have systems support us. But the types of scars that we hide, that we live with in secret, those scars do this type of long, slow damage, right? One of his books called like How to Slowly Kill Yourself in America. And so for me, I think felt criminality gives us, or just kind of expands, how can we name a thing? And is the way I feel legitimate enough to hold any type of empirical weight? Can it hold weight in court? And like, what do we do with that, right? Because in part, right, feelings aren't objective, right? Feelings are complicated. And then so I think we need a more complex analysis of them, right? But I think it can work hand in hand. I don't think they're synonymous, but I can see them kind of having some type of intimate relationship. But I haven't thought about them together. Thank you for that. Thank y'all. This was fun.